The year was 540 AD. Justinian's dream was about to come true. His legions were reclaiming Italy from the Goths and clearing North Africa of the Vandals. The law was being rewritten, and Hagia Sophia, the greatest temple of Christendom, was rising to the sky. It was as if the glorious days of the ancient world had returned, but it was only a mirage. While the empire was intoxicated with victory, fate had already prepared an enemy far more terrifying than sword and spear. An enemy that would take Rome's last breath, plunging Europe into the pitch-black darkness of a true dark age. Welcome to the Grim Chronicle. Today, we will witness the first global pandemic in history, the annihilation of half of humanity in mud and pus. Today, the apocalypse begins. Disaster came not with the sword, but with trade. The lifeblood that nourished the empire would also become its executioner. The enormous ships carrying grain from Egypt, from the fertile lands of the Nile to Constantinople, carried not only wheat in their holds, but also death.
Yersinia pestis. This bacterium traveled from the steppes of Central Asia, or the depth of Africa, in the stomachs of fleas, on the backs of black rats. Its first stop was the port of Pelusium in Egypt. From there, it spread to the Mediterranean. When the disease reached the capital, no one understood what they were up against. Procopius, the most important historian of the time, writes that people first saw ghosts, dark figures that struck and touched them as they walked in the street. These were the first delirious episodes brought on by the high fever caused by the disease. Soon, the real nightmare began. Procopius describes the course of the disease with terrifying coldness. It all began with a sudden fever, but this was no ordinary fever. The victims felt as if a furnace was burning inside their bodies. Within a few days, swellings the size of eggs, sometimes even larger, appeared in the areas where the lymph nodes are located, in the groin, armpits, and neck. These were called bubonic plagues. These swellings turned black, filled with pus and blood, and caused unbearable pain. Some fell into a coma and died silently. Others were seized by a terrible fit of madness. Driven mad by pain, they would run into the streets and try to throw themselves into the sea. The physicians were helpless. Some tried to open the swellings and drain the pus, but this only hastened the patient's agonizing death from blood loss. The disease spared no one. It affected the rich and the poor, the young and the old. Even Emperor Justinian contracted the disease, but miraculously survived. But his empire would not be as fortunate. At the peak of the epidemic, 5,000 or even 10,000 people, according to some sources, were dying daily in Constantinople. The city became a vast morgue. Initially, funerals were held. When the cemeteries filled up, people were buried in their gardens and the basements of their houses. But the death toll rose so high that the living could not keep up with the dead. Bodies were left to rot in the streets and inside houses. An unbearable, heavy stench of death settled over the city, detectable from miles away. Procopius describes the extent of the despair. When the grave diggers ran out, the authorities loaded the bodies onto ships in the Golden Horn and abandoned them to their fate in the middle of the sea. These ghost ships drifted with the wind, carrying death to other shores. Even more horrifying, the roofs of the towers on the city walls were removed. The bodies were piled on top of each other, pressed into these towers as if they were grain silos. Human dignity was crushed and destroyed under the weight of the struggle for survival. The only sounds in the city were the wails and the clatter of grave diggers' shovels. After ravaging the city for about 4 months, the plague slowed but never completely disappeared. It would return in waves for the next 2 centuries. The consequences were apocalyptic. It is estimated that between 40% and 50% of the then-known world population, that is, Europe and the Mediterranean basin, were wiped out. Justinian's dream of rebuilding Rome was stifled in the festering pits of plague. Famine struck because there were no peasants left to cultivate the fields. The imperial treasury collapsed because there were no citizens left to pay taxes. Conquests in Italy ceased because there were no soldiers left to recruit, leaving the borders vulnerable to barbarian raids. For the survivors, the world was no longer the same. They believed God had abandoned or punished them. The self-assured, urban, organized structure of antiquity gave way to fear, superstition, and a rural, introverted way of life. The Justinian plague was the final and greatest nail in the coffin of the Roman Empire. The Mediterranean world fell silent, cities emptied, roads deserted. But history abhors a vacuum. With Europe's population halved, new forces would rise to fill this vast power void. A new faith rising from the deserts of the south and ruthless warriors from the icy seas of the north were coming to build a new world on these ruins. In the next chapter of the grim chronicle, at this most vulnerable moment for Europe, we will witness the rise of Islam and a new threat knocking at the continent's gates. Join us, for history has never been so brutal.